Michael Lake, why is it so essential to achieve the Sustainable Development Goal 11?
Well, first of all, it's incredibly important for us to achieve a sustainable planet. And I just don't see it possible to do that without having sustainable communities. And knowing that cities consume 66% of the world's energy, produce 70% of the world's carbon emissions, that they occupy just 2 to 3% of the space on Earth, but yet consume 80% of its resources, cities are an integral part of that formula to achieve a sustainable planet.
You talked about Queen Elizabeth, who said she's irritated that they talk but they don't do. How can we make them do, and who is them?
It's a great question. You know, I think the them, I'll start with that, is everybody. It's individuals like you and I. It's our city leaders, it's our national leaders, and it's everybody in between. It's our business leaders. So really, nobody gets a pass on this one. And I know Queen Elizabeth wasn't preparing to make that quote, but I'm so glad it was caught and captured and shared, because especially coming into COP26 next week, it's not enough to talk. We have to start doing. And, you know, this is the 26th edition of this meeting. Had we done something 25 editions earlier, we'd be in a very different place as a planet. This might be the very last opportunity we have as a planet to reverse what we have done since the Industrial Revolution. And frankly, now is the time for societal revolution. And I don't mean take up arms. I'm just talking about everybody in society has their role to play, and we have to revolt against the status quo. That we have to take difficult choices at times, to do things differently, to step out of our comfort zone, to recognize that we're having an impact. Every one of us is having a detrimental impact to the future of this planet. You know, in the United States, our Native American population had this philosophy we refer to as 7 generations. Tribal elders, every decision they made, they would consider the impacts 7 generations out. So imagine if that first COP meeting, we were thinking in those terms, and thinking, or in any day since, thinking about the impacts that we have today, whether it's, you know, running our water longer than we need to, keeping our lights on, or industry not upgrading to more energy efficient systems, governments not supporting innovative policies or new technologies and implementing those projects. All of that has a detrimental effect on the ability of this planet to sustain itself. And as I said, we are bumping up really close to that point of no return.
What does education and knowing means in that system and in that change?
I mean, education is so important. Taking a step back, you can't do something until you're first aware that you need to do something. And there has been a lot of talk, not just about doing, but also talk about the realities of climate change, for instance. And, you know, there is this conversation that we've all heard about people who just don't believe in climate change. I was talking to another speaker earlier today, and we were saying how, you know, this is not a religion. It's not something to believe in. It's science. It is real. It has to be dealt with. You can't just choose to put your head in the sand and say you don't believe in it when the world around you is changing, when our storms and natural disasters are occurring at a greater intensity and greater frequency, when, whether it's wildfires or sea level rise and every other threat to society, they're real. You know, they're not, this isn't a question of believing whether or not those wildfires are real. They are real and they have real impacts. And I think that education piece is so important to accept the reality that we have rather than to choose not to believe that reality.
In your keynote, you also mentioned the pandemic. What role does the pandemic play? What role does the pandemic play?
I think the pandemic actually, of course it's a blessing and a curse perhaps. I mean, I don't have to talk about the tragic impacts of this pandemic and the amount of loss that countless families and individuals have experienced. But I'm a glass half full kind of person. So I look to the positive side, and for me the pandemic is an opportunity for cities and individuals, communities, to come out of this with a whole new appreciation for doing things differently. And I think for city leaders especially, going into the pandemic, the whole concept of smart cities was kind of like that sexy toy, that, if you could afford it, okay, great. Maybe you get a good positive headline out of it or something like that. It was a nice to have. But I think the pandemic taught us that these technologies are not nice to haves. They're now must haves. And cities that don't implement these new solutions and go through a digital transformation and protect themselves are truly at threat. And I don't just mean from pandemics, but I also mean economically threatened. Just the environmental impacts alone. I mean, 95% of the world's cities are coastal cities. When we talk about sea level rise, we're talking about losing a tremendous amount of what we now consider urban space to the ocean. So I do think that this pandemic in some ways was a wake-up call. I hope it was a wake-up call. And I hope that our public officials and business leaders will see it for that and will act accordingly.
What do you wish they do?
That's such a good question. I think with business leaders, they're famous for all their KPIs, key performance indicators. I think they need to consider climate impact of all of their decisions as a KPI and set hard goals for themselves. Recognizing the impact that they can and will have if they don't. For government leaders, I really think that one of the biggest challenges is doing things differently. And let's face it, government is not often cited as the example of innovation. And there's a reality to why that is. There isn't a culture for innovation in government. There's a culture of doing things the way they've always been done, and we have to change that. In the private sector, you're rewarded for doing something different and getting better results. In the public sector, you're not rewarded, and if anything, you put your own job at risk because if it should fail, you're the one who's going to suffer the consequences. We got to change that. We got to be more open to innovation and be willing, both as a government, but also as the people that government represents. We as a society have to say, no, I want my government to innovate. I want them to take a risk, and I accept the fact that not every project is going to be a tremendous success. There will be failures, but we learned something in the attempt, and that was good enough.